Sometimes the smallest act of kindness is the one destiny remembers forever. Long before the morning bells echoed across the valleys surrounding Blackwood Forest, the warm glow of a tiny bakery already spilled onto the quiet country road. The scent of fresh apples, cinnamon, and warm butter drifted through the crisp autumn air, inviting every traveler to slow down for just a moment. Inside the cozy shop, Grace Harper carefully lifted 2 golden apple pies from the old brick oven, smiling softly as the steam curled upward like gentle ribbons. She had opened the bakery years earlier after inheriting the little stone building from an elderly woman who once believed that every loaf of bread carried hope to someone who needed it most. Grace never became the wealthiest baker in the region, but every neighbor agreed that no one baked with more care than she did. She greeted every customer by name, quietly slipped extra pastries into the bags of struggling families, and never allowed anyone to leave hungry if she could help it. That chilly morning seemed no different until she noticed 2 small figures standing outside the front window. They looked no older than 8 or 9 years old, wrapped in oversized traveling cloaks that had collected dust from miles of walking. Their cheeks were pink from the cold, and although they tried to appear brave, their eyes lingered on the fresh pies resting inside the display case with unmistakable longing. Grace gently opened the wooden door before either boy could walk away. "Good morning," she said warmly. "It is too cold to stand outside. Please come in." The boys exchanged uncertain glances before quietly stepping across the doorway. Their boots were worn, their hair slightly untidy, and they carried themselves with surprising politeness despite their obvious exhaustion. Grace poured each of them a mug of warm apple cider before placing generous slices of freshly baked pie on simple white plates. Neither child reached for the food immediately. Instead, the older boy quietly asked, "Are you certain we may have this?" Grace smiled as though the answer were the easiest thing in the world. Food always tastes better when it is shared. Only then did both boys begin eating. Their careful manners suggested they had received excellent upbringing. Yet their grateful expressions revealed how long it had been since they had enjoyed an ordinary meal without fear or worry. As they ate, laughter slowly replaced hesitation. Crumbs collected on the younger boy's face, causing his older brother to laugh for the first time that morning. Grace handed him a clean napkin, pretending not to notice his embarrassment. The little bakery suddenly felt brighter than the rising sun outside. She asked neither where they had come from nor why they were traveling alone. She believed every stranger deserved kindness before questions. When the boys finished eating, they eagerly offered to sweep the bakery floor in exchange for the meal, but Grace gently shook her head. "If you truly wish to help," she said, "come back tomorrow and I will teach you how to make apple pies." Both boys looked at one another with wide smiles that transformed their tired faces. They thanked her with genuine excitement before disappearing down the quiet country road, promising they would return at sunrise. Standing alone in the doorway, Grace watched them until they vanished beyond the colorful maple trees, never imagining that the 2 polite children she had welcomed into her bakery, without hesitation, were the missing wolf pup princes of Blackwood Kingdom, and that before many more sunsets passed, the Alpha King himself would follow the same road in search of the only family that truly mattered to him. The following morning arrived wrapped in a thin blanket of silver mist that floated gently across the fields surrounding Grace Harper's little bakery. Before the first customer appeared, she was already kneading fresh dough upon the worn wooden counter while apples simmered slowly with cinnamon inside a copper pot. Just as the first rays of sunlight reached the windows, 2 familiar knocks sounded against the front door. Grace looked up with an immediate smile. The 2 boys had returned exactly as they had promised. Their traveling cloaks were still dusty from the forest paths, but their bright expressions carried far more confidence than the day before. "Good morning," Grace greeted them as she welcomed them inside. "Today we begin with flour, not pie." The younger boy laughed so enthusiastically that he accidentally sneezed into a cloud of flour only moments later, covering both himself and his older brother in white powder. Grace could not help laughing with them, and soon the little bakery echoed with cheerful voices that had been missing for far too long. She patiently showed them how to measure flour, crack eggs without breaking the shells into the bowl, stir warm butter into the mixture, and carefully fold apple slices beneath the soft pastry. Whenever one of the boys made a mistake, Grace simply smiled, and quietly demonstrated the step again. She never raised her voice. She believed that confidence grew best where patience lived. As the pies baked inside the old brick oven, the delicious aroma drifted outside, drawing neighbors toward the bakery. The boys proudly carried warm loaves of bread to elderly customers and carefully arranged fresh pastries inside the display case. Several villagers smiled at the unexpected sight of two energetic young helpers working so earnestly beside Grace. One elderly woman whispered that she had not seen the bakery feel so full of laughter in years. When lunchtime arrived, Grace served bowls of vegetable soup with slices of fresh bread. Before eating, the older boy hesitated. "Miss Grace," he asked softly, "why are you so kind to us when you do not even know who we are?" Grace placed another piece of bread beside his bowl before answering. "Sometimes people need kindness before they are ready to tell their stories. Names can wait. Hungry hearts should not." The boys exchanged quiet glances that carried emotions too deep for children their age. For the first time since arriving, they seemed able to breathe without fear. Over the following days, they returned every morning. They learned how to braid pastry edges, decorate pies with tiny apple leaves carved from dough, polish wooden tables, and greet every customer with warm smiles. Grace noticed they possessed unusually refined manners, always thanking every visitor and carefully cleaning every dish. Before leaving, she wondered whether they had once belonged to a wealthy household, but she respected their silence and never asked. Meanwhile, beyond the peaceful countryside, urgent messengers rode across Blackwood Kingdom carrying sealed royal notices. Every village received the same request, asking travelers to report any sign of two missing young princes who had quietly slipped away from the castle several days earlier. The search widened with every sunrise, yet no one imagined that the heirs to the kingdom spent their mornings laughing over flour-covered aprons inside a humble country bakery. Grace watched the boys leave once more beneath the golden light of late afternoon, waving until they disappeared beyond the maple trees, completely unaware that every joyful lesson she shared with them was gently healing two lonely hearts, while an entire kingdom searched desperately for the children she simply knew as kind boys who loved warm apple pie. Several peaceful days passed, and the little bakery became the brightest place along the quiet country road. Every sunrise seemed to arrive carrying laughter before the first customer even opened the door. Grace Harper no longer looked surprised when the two boys appeared beneath the old maple trees, each carrying a small basket of apples they had gathered along the forest trail. Together they prepared dough, polished wooden tables, and greeted every visitor with cheerful smiles that made the bakery feel more like a family home than a business. The older boy had become remarkably skilled at carefully arranging fresh pies inside the display case, while his younger brother proudly insisted on delivering warm bread to elderly neighbors who could no longer walk easily through the village. Grace quietly admired the kindness growing inside both children. Whatever hardships they had experienced before arriving at her door, they still chose compassion instead of bitterness. Far beyond the peaceful countryside, however, Blackwood Castle stood wrapped in growing concern. Inside the royal council chamber, detailed maps covered a massive oak table, while royal advisors marked every village, forest path, and trading road already searched. Weeks had passed since the two young princes had quietly disappeared from the castle during an early morning riding lesson. The guards blamed themselves. The advisors argued over strategy. Every hour without news deepened the silence filling the royal halls. At the center of the chamber stood Alpha King Daniel Hayes. He listened patiently to every report, but none of them brought comfort. His sons had never wandered away before. They were curious children, gentle by nature, yet the castle had slowly become a place of endless lessons, formal ceremonies, and constant protection. Daniel often wondered whether he had spent so much time ruling the kingdom that he had forgotten how simply children wished to feel understood. One experienced ranger stepped forward after returning from the northern villages. He explained that several travelers had spoken about two unusually polite young boys helping inside a small bakery near the edge of Blackwood Forest. No one believed the children were in danger. In fact, every witness described them laughing, serving customers, and learning to bake beside a kind young woman. The room grew completely still. Daniel studied the location marked upon the map, before quietly folding it closed. "Prepare no large escort," he instructed calmly. "If those children have truly found peace, I will not frighten them by arriving with an army." The advisors exchanged surprised glances, but none questioned his decision. Early the following morning, Daniel mounted his horse accompanied by only a single trusted guard who remained several hundred yards behind. Meanwhile, Grace spent another joyful afternoon teaching the boys how to weave delicate pastry strips across the tops of fresh apple pies. Flour covered the wooden counter, cinnamon filled the warm air, and both children proudly compared whose pie looked more beautiful. Grace laughed as she carefully corrected a crooked pastry edge before sliding the finished pies into the glowing brick oven. She noticed neither the distant rider approaching along the quiet road nor the royal crest barely visible beneath a traveling cloak. Outside, Daniel slowed his horse as the comforting aroma of apples and fresh bread drifted through the autumn breeze. Then he heard something he had not heard in many months. The unmistakable laughter of both of his sons floated through the open bakery window, light, carefree, and filled with genuine happiness. For several long moments, he remained completely still beside the old wooden fence, choosing not to interrupt the simple scene unfolding before him, because he suddenly understood that whatever waited beyond that doorway was far more valuable than anything his royal advisors had ever placed before a king. Daniel Hayes remained outside the bakery for several quiet moments, his hand resting lightly upon the wooden fence as warm laughter drifted through the open window. The sound was so unfamiliar that he almost questioned whether it truly belonged to his sons. Inside Blackwood Castle, every lesson had been carefully planned, every meal served according to royal tradition, and every conversation watched by devoted attendants. Yet here, inside a modest stone bakery tucked beside a winding country road, the two young princes laughed without hesitation as flour dust floated through golden afternoon sunlight. Daniel slowly removed his traveling gloves before walking toward the front door. The small bell hanging above it chimed softly as he stepped inside. Grace Harper looked up from the wooden counter with her usual welcoming smile, unaware that the quiet traveler before her ruled the entire kingdom. "Good afternoon," she said warmly. "Please come in. The apple pies have just finished baking." Before Daniel could answer, the younger boy excitedly lifted a pie from the cooling rack with both hands. "Miss Grace, does this one finally look right?" Grace leaned closer with playful seriousness before smiling proudly. "I believe it looks wonderful. You remembered every little leaf on the crust." The older brother laughed as he brushed flour from his sleeves. "He practiced 3 times before you arrived this morning." Daniel watched the simple exchange without interrupting. He noticed how naturally Grace encouraged them, never praising one child by diminishing the other, always finding something genuine to celebrate. She treated them neither as strangers nor as children who required constant correction. She simply treated them as boys learning something new. Grace finally turned toward the visitor carrying a fresh slice of warm apple pie upon a simple white plate. "You look as though you have traveled a long distance," she said kindly. "Please sit down before your tea grows cold." Daniel accepted the invitation with quiet gratitude. The rich aroma of apples, cinnamon, and butter filled the room as Grace poured fresh cider into a ceramic mug. The younger boy eagerly carried the plate toward him. "This one is our best pie yet," he announced proudly. "Miss Grace taught us how to braid the crust." Daniel accepted the plate with a gentle smile that reached his eyes for the first time in many days. He tasted the pie slowly, but it was not the flavor that captured his attention. It was the sight before him. His son stood comfortably beside Grace as though they had known her for years instead of days. Their shoulders no longer carried the invisible weight that had quietly settled upon them inside the castle. Their smiles appeared effortless. Their eyes reflected peace instead of obligation. Grace noticed the traveler watching the boys with unusual tenderness. "They have been a great help," she said softly. "Kind children make every place brighter." Daniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment, humbled by words spoken without any knowledge of who they truly were. Before he could respond, both boys suddenly turned toward him at the same time. Joy instantly illuminated their faces. The younger prince hurried across the room first, followed closely by his older brother. Without hesitation, both children embraced the traveler at once. "Father," they exclaimed together with unmistakable happiness. Silence gently settled over the bakery. Grace stood completely still, the empty teapot resting lightly in her hands as understanding slowly replaced surprise. Her eyes moved from the two boys to the quiet man she had welcomed as an ordinary traveler. Daniel looked toward Grace with calm sincerity rather than royal authority. In that simple moment, surrounded by the comforting fragrance of fresh apple pie and the warmth of a humble bakery, the Alpha King realized that the greatest gift anyone had offered his family had never been found inside a palace. It had been waiting all along inside the generous heart of a woman who had asked for nothing in return. Grace Harper remained silent for only a heartbeat before setting the teapot gently upon the wooden table. Surprise softened into understanding as she looked once more at the two boys smiling beside their father. Suddenly their careful manners, thoughtful words, and quiet dignity made perfect sense. Yet the discovery changed nothing in her heart. To Grace, they were still the same children who laughed when flour covered their faces and proudly carried warm bread to elderly neighbors. Daniel Hayes slowly knelt so he could embrace both sons without haste, closing his eyes for a brief moment as relief quietly replaced weeks of worry. Neither prince seemed eager to leave the little bakery. Instead, the younger boy hurried toward the cooling rack and carefully lifted another fresh apple pie. "Father," he said with unmistakable excitement, "this one is for you. We helped make it ourselves." His older brother nodded proudly. "Miss Grace said every pie tastes better when everyone shares it together." Daniel accepted the pie with genuine gratitude before looking toward Grace. "I owe you far more than thanks," he said softly. "You welcomed two strangers without asking for names, titles, or rewards. You gave my son something I could not provide despite everything the castle offers." Grace gently shook her head. "They only needed warmth, patience, and someone willing to listen. Every child deserves that." Daniel lowered his eyes as her simple words settled deeply within him. Inside Blackwood Castle, every comfort imaginable surrounded the young princes. Yet somewhere between duty and tradition, he had allowed ordinary moments of childhood to disappear. Here, inside a humble bakery, they had found joy in measuring flour, washing dishes, delivering bread, and waiting together beside a glowing oven. The younger prince reached for Grace's hand. "May father stay for supper?" he asked hopefully. Grace smiled. "There is always room for one." More at the table. As evening settled across the countryside, the four of them shared fresh apple pie, vegetable soup, warm bread, and quiet conversation beneath the gentle glow of hanging lanterns. Daniel listened while his sons eagerly described every lesson they had learned during the past several days, from kneading dough to decorating pastry with tiny apple leaves. They spoke more freely than they had in months, interrupting each other with cheerful laughter that filled every corner of the bakery. Grace listened with quiet contentment, occasionally offering another slice of pie or gently correcting a forgotten recipe. When the meal ended, Daniel noticed a small framed photograph resting upon the mantel. It showed the elderly woman who had once owned the bakery standing beside a much younger Grace. "She taught me that food is never only food," Grace explained after noticing his curiosity. "Sometimes it is how people remember they belong somewhere." Daniel remained thoughtful as he looked around the modest room. Every shelf had been polished by caring hands. Every loaf of bread had been baked with intention. Every visitor who entered this bakery was treated as though they already belonged. He finally understood why his sons had never wished to leave. Before the evening grew too late, Daniel stood and faced Grace with calm sincerity. "Tomorrow I must return to Blackwood Castle with my sons," he said gently. "But I hope this is not the end of our story. I would be honored if you would visit the castle as my guest, not because of my crown, but because my children have shown me something I should have discovered long ago. They did not simply find a baker. They found a home, and I would like to understand how you created it." Morning sunlight spilled across the bakery windows as Grace Harper stood quietly beside the old brick oven, watching the last tray of apple pies cool upon the wooden counter. The familiar scent of cinnamon and fresh bread filled the room, yet everything felt slightly different now that the truth had been revealed. The two young princes carefully packed baskets with warm rolls for several elderly neighbors, moving through the bakery with the same cheerful energy they had shown since the first day they arrived. Their royal identity had changed nothing about the kindness they had learned there. Daniel Hayes entered quietly after speaking with the royal guard waiting outside. He no longer carried himself as a king giving orders. Instead, He looked like a grateful father trying to find the right words. Grace offered him a warm cup of apple cider before anyone spoke. The younger prince eagerly placed another freshly baked pie onto the table. "We made this together before sunrise," he said proudly. Daniel smiled as he looked at the carefully braided crust. "It is the finest pie I have ever seen." Grace laughed softly. "That is because two determined young bakers refused to stop practicing." For a little while, the four of them shared breakfast exactly as they had shared supper the evening before. The conversation centered on recipes, autumn apples, village festivals, and the funny mistakes both boys had made while learning to bake. Daniel realized those ordinary moments carried a kind of peace that no royal banquet had ever achieved. After the meal, he finally turned toward Grace with quiet sincerity. "My invitation remains the same," he said. "I hope you will visit Blackwood Castle, but only if it is truly your choice. I do not wish to take you away from the life you have built here." Grace looked around the small bakery that had been her home for many years. Every wooden shelf, every flower box beneath the windows, every familiar customer who waved while passing outside carried precious memories. She gently folded her hands before answering. "I cannot leave this place forever. It has cared for me just as much as I have cared for it." Daniel nodded immediately. "Then do not leave it. Visit the castle for a season if you wish. Teach our cooks. Bake with my sons. Help us understand what they found here. When you wish to return home, the road will always remain open." Grace searched his face for any sign that the invitation carried hidden expectations, but she found only honesty. The older prince stepped forward with hopeful eyes. "Would you come for a little while?" he asked. "The castle has many kitchens, but none of them smell like home." Grace smiled warmly before kneeling beside both boys. "If I come, every lesson we shared here must continue there. We will bake together. We will share with others. We will welcome every visitor kindly. A castle should never forget how to feel like a home." Both princes eagerly agreed. Daniel quietly thanked her once more, understanding that she had accepted not because of his crown, but because two children had earned her trust. As the royal carriage prepared to leave later that morning, Grace carefully locked the bakery door, placed a handwritten notice promising her customers she would return soon, and stepped onto the country road beside the family she had never expected to meet. The warm fragrance of fresh apple pie lingered behind them as the journey toward Blackwood Castle began, carrying not only baskets of bread, but also the gentle hope that even the grandest kingdom could learn something beautiful from a small bakery built upon kindness. Blackwood Castle welcomed Grace Harper with ceremony, yet it was not the grand entrance that remained in everyone's memory. It was the sound of two young princes racing through the palace corridors with baskets of warm bread balanced carefully in their arms, while laughing with the carefree joy that had once seemed impossible inside those ancient stone walls. Servants paused in surprise as the boys eagerly invited everyone they passed to taste the apple rolls they had baked before sunrise. Grace followed behind them with an amused smile, offering quiet reminders to slow down before someone accidentally dropped a basket. Even the royal guards found themselves smiling as the comforting fragrance of fresh bread drifted through the castle for the first time in years. Daniel Hayes watched the scene from the upper gallery overlooking the Great Hall. He had spent countless mornings reviewing reports, hearing petitions, and preparing for matters of state. Yet none of those responsibilities had ever filled the castle with the warmth now spreading naturally from one kitchen. Grace never behaved as though she belonged above anyone else. Within hours, she had learned the names of the royal cooks, thanked every servant who carried supplies, and asked the gardeners whether fresh herbs might be planted beside the kitchen windows. She treated every person with the same kindness she had shown inside her small bakery. That afternoon, she gathered the palace bakers around a large wooden table and invited the princes to stand beside her. Rather than demonstrating perfect technique, she encouraged everyone to laugh at small mistakes, reminding them that the best recipes were often learned through patience instead of perfection. Soon flour dust floated through the bright kitchen, while experienced chefs accepted advice from children without embarrassment. Daniel quietly stepped inside, but remained unnoticed for several moments. He watched his sons confidently measuring flour, carefully helping elderly kitchen workers carry heavy bowls, and thanking every person who offered guidance. The older prince even paused to comfort a nervous young apprentice whose first loaf had collapsed inside the oven. Grace gently explained that no baker remembered only successful recipes. Everyone remembered the people who encouraged them to try again. Her words settled softly over the room, changing far more than a cooking lesson. During the following days, the atmosphere throughout Blackwood Castle continued transforming in quiet ways. The kitchen doors remained open longer, allowing the inviting aroma of cinnamon and fresh bread to drift through nearby hallways. The princes visited the servants' dining room each afternoon to share pastries they had prepared themselves. Gardeners began growing apple trees beside the herb gardens at Grace's suggestion, while children from nearby villages received invitations to visit the castle kitchens every weekend to learn simple recipes together. Daniel noticed that people spoke more freely, smiled more often, and lingered together after their work was finished. One peaceful evening, he found Grace standing alone beside an open window overlooking the courtyard where both princes played happily with children from the village. "I thought they needed protection," Daniel admitted quietly. Grace watched the boys with gentle pride before answering, "Children also need ordinary days they will remember with happiness." Daniel remained silent as he realized she had never tried to change the castle through authority or expectation. She had simply filled it with the same kindness that once welcomed two hungry boys into a humble bakery, and little by little the entire kingdom had begun learning how to smile again. Several weeks passed, and the changes inside Blackwood Castle no longer felt temporary. They had quietly become part of everyday life. The palace kitchens were filled with conversation instead of silence. Fresh bread greeted every sunrise, and the laughter of the two young princes echoed through the corridors often enough that even the oldest servants smiled before seeing who approached. Grace Harper never attempted to become the center of attention. She simply continued doing what had always come naturally. Each morning she baked beside the royal cooks, welcomed village children who visited to learn simple recipes, and reminded everyone that the best meals were those shared with grateful hearts. Daniel Hayes often observed these moments from a respectful distance. The more he watched, the more clearly he understood that Grace had never transformed the castle by changing its walls. She had transformed the people living inside them. One peaceful afternoon, after another successful baking lesson with children from nearby villages, Grace carried a basket of warm apple rolls into the castle gardens. The maple trees had begun displaying brilliant shades of gold and crimson, while the gentle breeze carried the familiar fragrance of cinnamon through the air. The two princes ran ahead, happily chasing fallen leaves before settling beneath a large oak tree with fresh pastries and warm cider. Daniel joined Grace along the stone pathway overlooking the gardens. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the boys laughing together with children from families across the kingdom, without titles or formal expectations separating them. Finally, Daniel broke the comfortable silence. "For many years," he admitted quietly, "I believed a kingdom became stronger through powerful walls, careful rules, and perfect order. You showed me something entirely different." Grace turned toward him with her calm, thoughtful smile. "People remember how a place makes them feel long after they forget how impressive it looked." Daniel nodded slowly. "That is exactly what my sons found inside your bakery. They found peace." He paused before continuing. "And I believe this castle has found it as well." Grace looked across the gardens where the young princes were proudly sharing the last apple rolls with several younger children. "They brought that kindness with them," she replied. "I only gave them a place where it could grow." Daniel admired the humility in her words. She accepted no praise for herself, always seeing the good already present in others. That quiet generosity had become the greatest lesson anyone inside Blackwood Castle had received. He took a slow breath before speaking again. "Grace, I once invited you here because my sons trusted you. Today I am asking something far more personal." She listened without interruption. "I am not searching for someone to complete a royal tradition," Daniel said with complete honesty. "I am searching for the person who has reminded my family what home truly feels like. Whether you remain here, return to your bakery, or divide your time between both places, I will respect every choice you make. I only hope you will allow us to continue building this future together." Grace remained silent for a thoughtful moment, her eyes resting upon the joyful scene unfolding beneath the old oak tree. She smiled softly before answering. "A home is never built because one person stays. It is built because every person chooses kindness each day. If that remains true, then I believe this journey should continue." Daniel smiled with quiet gratitude, understanding that her answer was not a promise born from obligation, but from trust freely given, and that made it more valuable than any royal vow ever spoken. Another spring arrived, carrying the familiar fragrance of apple blossoms across Blackwood Kingdom. The little bakery beside the forest road had reopened exactly as Grace Harper had promised, its windows glowing warmly each morning, while fresh pies cooled upon the wooden shelves. Yet life no longer belonged to only one place. Several days each week Grace welcomed neighbors, travelers, and village children into her bakery, teaching them that every loaf of bread began with patience and every shared meal began with kindness. On the remaining days, she traveled to Blackwood Castle, where the palace kitchens had become lively gathering places instead of silent workrooms. No one considered the two places separate anymore. The quiet country bakery and the great castle now felt connected by the same generous spirit. The young princes grew happier with every passing season. They continued helping prepare apple pies before sunrise whenever Grace visited, proudly delivering warm baskets of bread to castle workers, gardeners, stable hands, and guests arriving from distant villages. They never forgot the lessons learned inside the small stone bakery where no one cared about royal titles. Daniel Hayes often watched his sons moving confidently among people from every walk of life, grateful that they had learned to value kindness before status. One bright afternoon, the kingdom celebrated its annual harvest festival inside the castle gardens. Long wooden tables stretched beneath flowering trees. Musicians filled the air with cheerful melodies, and families from every corner of Blackwood shared food together without distinction. Grace organized a baking table where children eagerly shaped pastry into leaves, flowers, and little animals before sliding their creations into large brick ovens built especially for community gatherings. Laughter echoed across the gardens as flower dust floated through warm sunlight, reminding Daniel of the very first moment he had stood quietly outside her bakery, listening to his sons laugh again. He walked toward Grace, carrying 2 freshly baked apple pies prepared by the princes themselves. "They insisted these belonged to you," he said with a gentle smile. Grace accepted the pies and laughed softly after noticing the familiar braided crust she had taught them months earlier. "Their hands have become steadier," she observed proudly. "So have their hearts," Daniel replied. They looked across the gardens where both boys welcomed younger children to help serve slices of pie before taking any for themselves. Grace recognized that the greatest lesson had never been baking at all. It had always been learning to share joy with others. As evening settled across the kingdom, hundreds of lanterns illuminated the castle grounds with warm golden light. Daniel and Grace stood together watching families gather around long tables filled with fresh bread, apple pies, soup, and laughter. Nothing about the moment felt grand because of wealth or power. It felt unforgettable because everyone belonged. Daniel quietly thanked Grace once more, not as a king honoring a guest, but as a father grateful for the woman whose ordinary kindness had quietly transformed extraordinary lives. Grace smiled toward the glowing windows of the distant bakery visible beyond the rolling hills before looking back at the joyful castle courtyard. She understood that home was never a single building. Home was every place where people chose compassion instead of pride, generosity instead of fear, and hope instead of loneliness. Long after the music faded and the lanterns dimmed beneath the stars, the comforting aroma of warm apple pie continued drifting through Blackwood, reminding every heart that the sweetest kingdoms are not built by crowns, but by simple acts of kindness shared one day at a time.